The afternoon sun slanted through the large windows of the English classroom, casting long, sleepy shadows across the rows of desks. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, chalk dust, and the faint, sweet aroma of a teenager's cherry lip balm somewhere in the front row. For most of the students, the period was dragging, the teacher's voice a low, monotonous hum against the drone of the fluorescent lights overhead. But in the very back row, tucked into a corner as if trying to become part of the wall, sat a girl who was anything but asleep. Her name was Maya, and in this room she was a ghost. Maya was a master of invisibility. She had perfected the art of being present without being noticed. Her dark, wavy hair was always a curtain she could hide behind when needed. Her posture was permanently slightly slumped, a non-threatening curve that made her seem smaller than she was. She never raised her hand, never called out, and rarely even lifted her gaze from the worn notebook open on her desk. This notebook was her world, her fortress, and her voice all bound in a simple cardboard cover. While other students doodled in the margins or passed notes, Maya's pen moved with a quiet, steady purpose. She wasn't just taking notes. She was having a conversation with the text, with the teacher, and with herself. A conversation no one else could hear. Her teacher, Mr. Davison, was a man who believed the classroom was a stage. He was a performer who thrived on the energy of debate and discussion. He paced the front of the room with a restless energy, his hands often slicing through the air to emphasize a point. He loved it when his students argued, when they threw ideas back and forth like a ball, challenging each other and, most importantly, challenging him. To him, an essay was just a static snapshot of a thought, but a spoken argument was a living, breathing thing. Participation wasn't just a part of the grade. It was the entire point of his class. And Maya, with her silent intensity and her flawless, insightful essays, was a puzzle he couldn't solve and an affront to his teaching philosophy. He noticed everything about her, though he pretended not to. He saw the way her pen would fly across the page when he posed a particularly difficult question. He saw the slight furrow of her brow, the focused intensity in her eyes as she stared at the board. He knew she was thinking more deeply than half the kids who blurted out whatever half-formed idea popped into their heads. And her essays, they were a source of constant frustration for him. They were brilliant. They were filled with a quiet wisdom and a unique perspective that made him read them twice. But they were written by a stranger, a phantom. Who was this girl who could dissect the motivations of a complex literary character on paper, but couldn't manage a simple, "I agree" in class? He had convinced himself it wasn't shyness. Shyness he could work with. No, he decided it was arrogance. She thought she was too good for their little discussions. She was hoarding her brilliance, and that, in his mind, was a sin in a place built for sharing ideas. One Tuesday, while discussing a novel about a young woman who felt trapped by her small town, Mr. Davison decided to test his theory. The discussion was lively, with several students offering their opinions on whether the protagonist was brave or selfish for wanting to leave. Mr. Davison let the debate rage for a while, his eyes scanning the room. They landed, as they often did, on Maya. Her head was down, her pen scratching furiously at the paper. He could see she had filled nearly half a page. "Maya," he said, his voice suddenly cutting through the chatter. The tone was casual, but it had a sharp edge that everyone in the room recognized. The other students fell silent, a ripple of awareness passing through them. They all knew what was coming. It was a ritual they had witnessed before. Maya's hand froze mid-sentence. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a look that was part deer in the headlights, part cornered animal. She looked at Mr. Davison, then at the faces of her classmates, all turned toward her. The classroom walls seemed to close in. "You've been writing quite a lot over there," Mr. Davison continued, leaning against his desk and crossing his arms. A small, knowing smile played on his lips. "You must have some strong thoughts on this. Why don't you share them with us? Do you think Eliza was brave for leaving, or was she just running away from her responsibilities?" The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Maya's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She could feel a hot blush creeping up her neck, burning her cheeks. The words she had so eloquently written down just moments ago about courage being a personal, quiet thing about the different forms of responsibility had evaporated. In her head they were beautiful and clear, but the thought of speaking them aloud, of having them judged and possibly torn apart in front of everyone, made her throat feel tight. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, and she was certain they were all thinking the same thing. Just say something. I don't know, she finally mumbled, her voice so quiet he had to ask her to repeat it. I don't know, she said, a little louder, her eyes fixed on a spot on her desk. She felt a wave of shame wash over her. It wasn't true. She did know. She knew so much that it was a heavy weight inside her, but she couldn't lift it. Mr. Davison's smile faded, replaced by a look of profound disappointment that was somehow worse than anger. You don't know, he repeated, his voice flat. That's a shame, Maya. Your last essay on this book was one of the best I've read all year. You seem to know a lot then. He let the comment hang in the air, a thinly veiled accusation. He was no longer asking a question. He was making a point. He was using her silence as a public example. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone coughed. Mr. Davison stared at her for another long moment, his frustration palpable. He had wanted to force her out of her shell, to make her see that her ideas were meant to be shared. Instead, he had just made her shrink. He sighed, a sound of weary defeat, and turned back to the rest of the class. All right, anyone else? Someone who does know? The discussion cautiously started up again, but the energy was gone. Maya kept her head down for the rest of the period, her pen now still on the page. She didn't hear another word that was said. She just felt the lingering heat of her embarrassment and the heavy, suffocating weight of the silence she had chosen, and the silence that had been forced upon her. As the bell rang, she was the first one out the door, escaping into the crowded hallway, a ghost fleeing the one place where she desperately wanted to be seen but was terrified to be heard. The days that followed felt like a slow-motion countdown to a dreaded execution. The incident in class had carved a hollow space inside Maya, a space filled with the echoing voice of her teacher and the imagined whispers of her classmates. She walked through the school hallways with her head down even more than usual, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for a physical blow. The modern monologue assignment, which should have been an exciting opportunity for a girl who lived and breathed words, had become a source of constant, low-grade terror. It was a perfect storm, a trap designed specifically for her by a teacher who didn't even understand the nature of the creature he was trying to capture, while other students spent their free periods debating which famous movie speech to perform or which dramatic scene from a popular play to act out. Maya had retreated into herself. She didn't look to the words of others. Instead, she had spent several nights with a single lamp burning, a pen in her hand, and a fresh sheet of paper on her desk. She wrote about the feeling of being a ghost in her own life, about the weight of unspoken thoughts piling up inside her like heavy stones. She wrote about the frustration of having a voice in her mind that was strong and clear, but a voice in her throat that was shy and fragile. She poured all of her fear, her anger, and her quiet, stubborn hope onto the page. The resulting piece wasn't a monologue. It was a piece of her soul, carefully transcribed. She had folded and refolded the single sheet of paper so many times that it was soft and worn at the creases. Like a much-loved letter, the day of the performances arrived with a strange energy in the classroom. The air was thick with a mix of teenage bravado and genuine stage fright. Mr. Davison, for his part, seemed to be enjoying the drama. He sat at his desk, a king presiding over his court, occasionally calling out encouraging or teasing comments. A lanky boy went first, delivering a passionate, if slightly shaky, speech from a superhero movie, flexing his muscles for effect. The class clapped politely. Then a girl with a bright pink backpack performed a scene from a sitcom, getting a few easy laughs. The performances continued, each one a small, safe performance. Some were good, some were forgettable, but they were all from someone else's script. They were all masks. With each student who took their turn and returned to their seat, Maya's heart beat a little faster. She felt like a prisoner in a lineup, watching the person ahead of her get called forward for judgment. She could feel Mr. Davison's eyes on her, a persistent, heavy weight. He was waiting. This was his moment, the grand finale of his semester-long campaign to force her into the light. He believed he was teaching her a life lesson, that he was breaking her out of a self-imposed prison. He couldn't see that he was just building a different set of bars around her, bars made of fear and public expectation. Finally, there were only 2 students left. A boy who was a star on the school's debate team went up and delivered a flawless, powerful political speech. He was confident, loud, and commanding. He was everything Mr. Davison wanted in a student. The teacher beamed, clapping loudly along with the rest of the class. "Excellent! Excellent work!" he boomed. And then his eyes swiveled to the back corner. "All right, just one left, Maya, your turn." The way he said her name sent a jolt of ice through her veins. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. He leaned back in his chair, a look of keen, almost predatory anticipation on his face. He had set the stage perfectly. Following the debate team star, her quiet, hesitant performance was bound to look like a failure. That was his plan. Maya's feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Her notebook was open, but the words were just a blur. She could feel the eyes of every single student in the room on her. The silence was different now. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a tense, waiting silence, thick with unspoken questions. Would she do it? Would she just sit there and refuse? A few students were already smirking, glancing at each other. They knew this was the moment Mr. Davison had been waiting for all semester. "Maya," Mr. Davison said again, his voice losing its casual edge and taking on a harder, more impatient tone. "We don't have all day. The class is waiting to see what all those brilliant essays amount to in the real world. Let's see if you can speak your ideas as well as you write them." He let the insult hang in the air, a challenge designed to provoke her. "Come on up." "Try to project this time. We want to be able to hear you in the back." A few students let out short, sharp laughs. The sound was like a slap in the face. Maya felt a hot surge of humiliation. Her hands were trembling so badly that she had to clasp them together in her lap to stop them from shaking. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and into the earth's core. But she also felt a tiny flicker of something else deep inside her. It was a spark of anger, a quiet defiance. He wanted to embarrass her. He wanted to see her fail. She looked at the worn piece of paper on her desk, the one that held her own words. It was her shield and her sword. Slowly, mechanically, she pushed her chair back. The sound of the legs scraping against the linoleum floor was unnaturally loud in the silent room. She stood up, her legs feeling weak and wobbly. Every step toward the front of the classroom felt like a journey across a tightrope suspended over a bottomless pit. She could feel the weight of 25 pairs of eyes on her back. She kept her gaze fixed on the worn wooden floor in front of her, counting the cracked tiles as she walked. When she finally reached the small, empty space at the front of the room, she turned to face the class. The sea of faces was a blur of judgment and curiosity. She clutched the single, folded piece of paper in her hand, her knuckles white. Mr. Davison watched her, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He had won. He had forced her into the open. Now he was waiting for her to crumble. Maya stood at the front of the classroom, a small island in a sea of staring faces. The worn piece of paper in her hand felt damp with sweat from her palm. She could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each second a loud, hammering beat in her ears. The silence was a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. Mr. Davison hadn't moved. He was still leaning against his desk, his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of impatience and smug expectation. He was waiting for her to fail, to confirm his theory that her brilliance was a sham, a quiet trick played on paper. A few students in the front row were whispering to each other behind their hands. A boy in the second row was doodling in his notebook, already bored. Maya felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her. This was a mistake. She should have just refused, taken the failing grade, and disappeared back into her corner. Anything was better than this public exposure, this feeling of being a specimen under a microscope. "Well, Maya?" "We're all waiting," Mr. Davison said, his voice sharp and cutting through the silence. He gestured with one hand, a quick dismissive flick of the wrist. "Whenever you're ready." She took a shaky breath, the air catching in her throat. She looked down at the paper, at the neat, familiar handwriting that was the only thing that felt real in this moment. She focused on the first line, the one she had rewritten a dozen times until it felt just right. She opened her mouth, but at first only a small squeak came out. Someone in the back snickered. Her face burned hotter, and she was sure she must be as red as a fire engine. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, blocking out the faces, and tried again. This time a sound came out, but it was barely a whisper. It was a thin, reedy thing, trembling with so much fear that it was hard to understand the words. "There's a room full of people," she began, her voice so quiet that the students in the back row leaned forward in their seats, straining to hear. "And it's loud. So loud. The noise is a wall, a solid thing, and you're standing on the other side of it?" She paused, her heart pounding. She could feel Mr. Davison's eyes on her, willing her to stop. She could feel the rest of the class losing interest. This was exactly what he had wanted. She was a failure. Her brilliant ideas were trapped inside a body that was too afraid to let them out. She wanted to crumple the paper, throw it on the floor, and run out of the room and never come back. But then she looked at the words again. She remembered the nights she had spent writing them, the feeling of finally getting something right, of putting a name to the feeling that had been her constant companion for years. These were her words. They were true. And for some reason that thought gave her a tiny spark of courage. It wasn't a fire, not yet. It was just a flicker, a single stubborn ember in a pile of cold ash. She decided to keep going, if only for herself. If she was going to embarrass herself, she would do it by saying something that mattered. She took another breath, this one a little deeper. "You stand on the other side of the wall," she continued, her voice still a whisper, but a little steadier now. "And you have things to say. Important things. But the wall is too thick to break through. So you just watch. You watch the people laugh and argue and share their stories. And you build your own world inside your head, a world where the wall doesn't exist. A world where your voice has a shape and a sound, where it can fill a room." As she spoke, a strange thing started to happen. The boy who had been doodling had put his pen down. The whispers in the front row had stopped completely. The classroom, which had been buzzing with bored energy just a minute ago, was now perfectly still. It wasn't the tense, awkward silence from before. It was a listening silence. Maya could feel it. She risked a quick glance up from her paper. Her eyes met those of a girl named Chloe, who was usually one of the loudest and most popular kids in class. Chloe wasn't smirking. She was leaning forward, her elbows on her desk, her expression one of intense concentration. She was actually listening. She was hearing the words, not just the weak, trembling voice that was speaking them. Seeing that look on Chloe's face was like a key turning in a lock inside Maya. It was a small thing, but it was huge. It was a sign that her words were making it past the wall. Someone was hearing her. That tiny spark of courage inside her grew a little warmer. She looked back down at her paper, but she wasn't just reading the words anymore. She was feeling them. Her voice, which had been a shaky whisper, began to gain a little bit of strength. It was still quiet, but it was clearer, more resonant. "People think you're quiet because you have nothing to say," she went on, her voice gaining a new, subtle layer of emotion. It wasn't just fear anymore. There was a hint of frustration, a touch of sadness. "They think you're empty. But you're not empty. You're full. You're so full of words and thoughts and feelings that you're afraid you'll burst if you ever let them out. You're afraid of what they'll sound like in the open air. You're afraid they'll get broken." She looked up again, this time scanning the faces in the room. No one was doodling. No one was whispering. Every single eye was on her. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a judgment. It felt like a connection. She was no longer a ghost performing for an audience. She was a person sharing a piece of her truth, and they were letting her. Mr. Davison was still leaning against his desk, but his posture had changed. His arms were no longer crossed over his chest in a defensive, challenging pose. They were hanging loosely at his sides. The smug look had been wiped from his face, replaced by an expression of deep, unreadable concentration. He was no longer a teacher waiting for a student to fail. He was just another person in the room, listening to a story he had never heard before. Maya felt a sense of control she had never experienced before. The fear was still there, a quiet hum in the back of her mind, but it was no longer in charge. The words were, and the words wanted to be heard. Her hesitant beginning was over. Something else was about to begin. The shift in the room was a tangible thing, like a change in air pressure before a storm. Maya felt it. It was the absence of judgment. The snickers were gone, the bored doodling had ceased, and the impatient shifting in seats had been replaced by a stillness so complete she could hear her own heart beating. The single spark of courage she had felt earlier had caught a breeze, and it was beginning to glow. She looked down at the paper in her hand, at the words that had been her only friends for so long, and then she did something that surprised even herself. She carefully folded the paper and placed it on the small lectern at the front of the room. She didn't need it anymore. The words were inside her now. She took a small step away from the lectern, standing in the center of the small open space. Her back straightened, just a little. Her shoulders, which had been hunched around her ears for protection, relaxed. She looked out at the class, not as a group of judges, but as individuals. She saw the boy who had been doodling, his pen now frozen above his notebook. She saw Chloe, the popular girl, her mouth slightly agape. And she saw Mr. Davison. His arms were no longer crossed. His hands were resting on the edge of his desk, and he was leaning forward, his body tense with an attention that was no longer challenging, but captivated. "People have a name for it," Maya continued, her voice clearer now, stronger. It was no longer a whisper, but a quiet, steady stream that flowed easily to the back of the room. "They call it shyness. They say it's a cute little quirk, a personality trait. But it's not cute. It's a cage. The bars are made of fear, and the lock is their expectations. And every time they try to force you to speak, to come out of your shell, they're just rattling the bars. They don't understand they're not helping you escape. They're just reminding you that you're trapped." A collective, almost inaudible breath went through the room. Her words were no longer just a personal confession. They were a universal truth that many of them had felt but never been able to articulate. The boy who was always quiet in the back, the girl who never raised her hand, they all felt it. Maya was giving a voice to the silent ones. "And the loudest people," she said, her voice gaining a new edge, a sharp, pointed frustration. "The ones who are so comfortable in the world, they think they own the air. They think silence is empty space, a void that needs to be filled with their own voice. They don't understand that silence can be full. It can be so full it's screaming. It's full of thoughts that are too complex for a quick answer, full of feelings that are too deep for a casual conversation. They hear our silence and they think it's nothing. They don't realize they're standing next to an ocean and complaining they can't hear a waterfall." Her eyes found Mr. Davison's, and for the first time all semester she didn't look away. She held his gaze. He was no longer a distant figure of authority. He was the audience. He was the one she was talking to. In his eyes she saw a flicker of something. It wasn't anger. It was confusion, quickly followed by a dawning, uncomfortable recognition. He was starting to understand. He was the one who owned the air in this room. He was the one who heard her silence and thought it was nothing. The monologue was no longer just a performance. It was a mirror, and she was holding it up to his face. He felt a knot form in his stomach. All those times he had called on her, all those sarcastic comments about her brilliant essays, he had told himself he was being a good teacher, pushing a student to reach her potential. But hearing her words, feeling the raw, controlled power behind them, he saw it for what it was: arrogance. He had been so sure his way was the only way, so confident that the loud, debater-type student was the ideal, that he had tried to crush the very thing that made her unique. He saw her silence not as a cage, but as a garden he was too impatient to let grow. He felt a hot wave of shame wash over him, and for the first time in years, he felt small in his own classroom. "But inside the cage," Maya said, her voice softening again, but this time with a new kind of strength. It wasn't the strength of anger, but the strength of truth. "Inside that quiet room, in that space inside my head, I am a giant. I build cities with my thoughts. I paint sunsets with my feelings. I have conversations with philosophers and walk on the moon. My voice is a symphony that no one else can hear, and it is the most beautiful sound in the world. You think I'm small because I'm quiet, but you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. You're missing the whole world that's hidden beneath the surface." She wasn't just speaking anymore. She was living the words. Her hands, which had been clenched into fists at her sides, began to move, illustrating her thoughts with graceful, purposeful gestures. She painted a city in the air. She traced the curve of a sunset. Her eyes, which had been so downcast, were now bright and alive, scanning the faces in the room, connecting with each person for a moment. She was no longer the ghost in the back row. She was the center of the universe, and everyone in that room was orbiting her. The students were completely mesmerized. They weren't just watching a classmate do a presentation. They were witnessing a transformation. They were seeing a side of Maya they never knew existed, a side so powerful and compelling that it changed their entire perception of her. The quiet girl was a storyteller, a poet, a force of nature. The air in the room was thick with emotion, a mix of awe, empathy, and a little bit of guilt from those who had dismissed her or laughed at her silence. Mr. Davison was speechless. He had come into this class today determined to prove a point, to force a student to conform to his idea of what a good student should be. He had set a trap, and she had walked into it. But she hadn't gotten caught. She had taken the trap, the snare he had laid for her, and had woven it into a tapestry of such beauty and power that it left him utterly humbled. He had wanted to hear her voice, and now he was hearing it, louder and clearer than he had ever heard any student's voice before. It wasn't the voice he had expected, but it was the one she needed to have. And it was magnificent. He opened his mouth to say something, to interrupt, to regain control of the situation, but no words came out. He had been a teacher for 15 years, and for the first time he had absolutely no idea what to say. The final line hung in the air, not like a question waiting for an answer, but like a statement of fact that needed no proof. It was a quiet, powerful truth that settled over the room like a soft blanket. For a long moment there was no sound at all. It wasn't the awkward, heavy silence from the beginning of her performance, a silence filled with judgment and expectation. This was different. This was a silence of pure, unadulterated awe. The clock on the wall continued its relentless tick-tock, but even that seemed distant, muffled, as if the room had been sealed off from the rest of the world. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon sunbeams, tiny, silent witnesses to the transformation that had just occurred. Maya stood there, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath, a faint sheen of sweat on her forehead. She felt a strange sense of calm, as if she had just surfaced from a long dive and was finally able to breathe again. The silence was broken by a single, sharp clap. It came from a boy in the front row who was known more for his pranks than his praise. The sound was so unexpected in the quiet that it made a few people jump. But then another person joined in. And another. It was like a rainstorm starting with a few scattered drops before growing into a downpour. The clapping grew louder and faster, filling the room with a thunderous, rhythmic sound that was nothing like the polite, obligatory applause that had followed the other performances. This was raw, enthusiastic, and real. It was a roar of appreciation, a wave of sound that washed over Maya, making her feel warm and seen for the first time in a very long time. Then something even more surprising happened. Chloe, the popular girl, was the first to stand up. She pushed her chair back with a scrape and rose to her feet, clapping with an energy that was almost fierce. One by one, then in groups of 2 and 3, the other students followed her lead. Soon, the entire class was on their feet, their faces turned toward Maya, their applause a deafening crescendo of respect and admiration. Maya stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. She saw faces she had only ever seen in passing, faces she had been too afraid to even look at, and they were all smiling at her, cheering for her. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought her to her knees washed over her. It wasn't just applause. It was an acceptance she had never dared to hope for. The bell, shrill and insistent, finally cut through the noise. The spell was broken. The students began to gather their things, but the atmosphere in the room was completely different. As they filed out, they didn't just walk past her. They made a point to stop by her desk. A quiet girl who sat near the window gave her a shy, meaningful nod. The boy who had been doodling tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Wow, just wow." Chloe gave her a quick hug. "You were incredible," she whispered before disappearing into the crowded hallway. Each small interaction was a brick, building a new foundation of confidence under Maya's feet. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a part of their world, and they were welcoming her in. Through it all, Mr. Davison remained at his desk, a silent observer. He watched as his students, the same teenagers he thought he knew so well, surrounded the girl he had tried so hard to break. He saw the genuine respect in their eyes, the way they listened to her, the way they valued her, and he felt a crushing sense of shame. He had been so focused on forcing her to fit into his mold of a good student that he had completely failed to see the brilliant, unique person she already was. He had mistaken her silence for emptiness, her depth for arrogance. All those sarcastic comments, all those public challenges, they weren't the actions of a good teacher. They were the actions of a small man who felt threatened by a quiet strength he couldn't understand. He had wanted to teach her a lesson, but she had ended up teaching him a much bigger one. When the last student had left, and the room was empty except for the two of them, the silence returned. But this time it was heavy with all the things that had been left unsaid. Mr. Davison finally stood up. He walked slowly, almost hesitantly, from behind his desk and toward the front of the room where Maya was still packing her bag. His footsteps, usually so confident and loud, seemed soft and uncertain on the linoleum floor. He stopped a few feet away from her, the space between them feeling like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. "Maya," he said. His voice was not the loud, performative voice he used in class. It was quiet, almost hoarse, and filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. It sounded like regret. Maya zipped up her backpack and slung it over her shoulder. She turned to face him, her expression calm. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. The cage was open, and she had walked out of it on her own. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a person. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her posture, the quiet dignity that had always been there. He took a deep breath. He started, then paused, searching for the right word. He couldn't find one. "That was the most authentic performance I have ever seen in this classroom." He let out a long, slow breath, as if a great weight had been lifted from his chest. "I am sorry." He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to explain his reasoning. He just offered a simple, sincere apology. And in that moment, he wasn't just a teacher. He was a man admitting he was wrong. Maya looked at him for a long moment. She saw the humility in his eyes, the genuine remorse. She didn't need to hear anything more. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you," she said softly. It wasn't an acceptance of his apology, but a dismissal of the need for one. She was no longer waiting for his validation. She turned and walked out of the classroom, her steps sure and steady. She didn't look back. Mr. Davison stood alone in the empty room, staring at the empty space where she had stood. He had spent the entire semester trying to get her to speak, and in the end she had left him speechless. He had learned a lesson that day about the many different forms of a voice, and about the danger of underestimating the quiet ones. As he looked out the window at the students flooding the hallways, he knew he would be a different teacher from this day forward. And somewhere in that crowd, walking with a new confidence and a lighter heart, was a girl who had finally found her voice. not because a teacher had broken her shell, but because she had decided, on her own terms, to show the world the pearl that was growing inside it all along.